This session that we wanted to have today is a brief session, a 1-hour session, and this is hosted by Amnesty International Kenya. This is also hosted by the Civic Freedoms Forum, of which a number of organizations are members, and I can see a lot of CFF members here, and the Kenya Community Development Foundation, KCDF. My name is Grace Maingi, and I have the privilege of working at KCDF. And for us, and as well as for Amnesty International Kenya and for CFF, we have a great interest in ensuring that there is collective action, there is strategies around how we are moving, transitioning from to the PBO Act, how we are addressing public education around this issue, but also ensuring that our voices are heard with regards to the various structures within the PBO Act. And so for us, this session was to be a briefing session. We have had a series of meetings, and CFF will be talking about that in terms of the meetings they have been holding, their plans for the PBO Summit. And so this is just one of a many of meetings that are ongoing to ensure that as many organizations are aware of the contents of the Act, are aware of the transitions, what is required, but also that we have an opportunity to ask questions and to strategize as we move forward. Today, we have the privilege and pleasure to have with us the Executive Director for Amnesty International Kenya, Irungu Houghton, who has also worked on the PBO Act for a number of years in various formations when he was at SID, in other organizations as well. He has been a key actor within this work. And so when we had a conversation, we agreed that Irungu will spend about 20 minutes just talking about the history, the context that we're in as we are in this moment around the operationalization of the PBO Act. We also have the privilege to have with us John Owegi, who is the Executive Director for CFF, Civic Freedoms Forum, of which a number of organizations are members, and again, is really driving the force around our engagement around the PBO Act. And so he will be speaking to what has been currently happening for the past week, what are the plans for the PBO Summit, and what are the strategies being put in place so that then we have good information moving forward. We'll then have a Q&A session whereby you'll be able to raise your hand. We'll bring you on mic because I recognize we're all muted. You'll come on mic, make a comment, ask a question, and the panelists will be able to address that as well. So for those who have just joined us, please welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Indicate your name, your organization, where you are located, so that then we can have a robust conversation. So as we move forward, Irungu, it's been a journey, and we don't say that lightly in terms of the work that was done around, first of all, drafting the PBO Act, the thinking around it, the challenges that civil society organizations have had with regards to civic space, with regards to registration. And so the whole thinking around the PBO Act, what we wanted to see, what we hope to achieve. I'm inviting you to walk us through that for those who perhaps do not have the context or would want to hear more of the history. We know why we wanted to have the PBO Act and really ensuring that those who work for public good were able to play that role, we're able to be organized, we're able to self-regulate, self-organize, and really ensure the benefits of the work to the Kenyan people is felt. And so I would want to now invite you, Irungu, walk us through what it's been. And I hope you have documented this somewhere or are planning to document it. We know it has not been an easy journey. So walk us through that and welcome for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Grace. Let me just check. Am I audible, Grace?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Excellent. So good morning, everybody, and perhaps good evening to some of you who may be joining us from elsewhere. Let me just start by really recognizing the collective efforts of probably 2 generations of PBO leaders to this creating this moment where we have another, I guess, a moment where we can recreate and reboot the sector. I guess the PBO Act has defined the sector in terms of its struggle for enabling environment for over a decade now. So I'm going to very quickly go through the past, the promise, and the implications of what has just happened. So for some of you will be aware that the PBO Act was enacted after a very intense collaboration and partnership between civil society organizations, NGOs, and the state back in the 2010s. It was debated in Parliament. The 10th Parliament basically made some changes, but broadly it went through in a form that was pleasing to the civil society community. It was then assented to by the president. And then, unfortunately, the administration changed. In came two individuals, the president and the deputy president, who were indictees on the International Criminal Court. They were very bitter. Their allies were very bitter at the civil society organizations, in particular human rights organizations, for shielding and protecting witnesses that had evidence with regards to the post-election violence cases. And that really was the beginnings of really outright hostility between the Jubilee administration and the NGO community. It lasted about 3 years. We saw about 5 amendments, attempted amendments to the NGO Coordination Act, an act that really had overstayed its time even by then, as it was a one-party legislation. We saw an attempt, a very vicious attempt in 2014 to essentially introduce amendments that would have really sucked 85% of the budget out of NGOs by the infamous 15% cap. This was really borrowed from the Ethiopian context, where Ethiopian NGOs almost disappeared, advocacy organizations disappeared overnight, as they were restricted from receiving foreign funding if they did any form of public advocacy. A number of organizations, even here present, were deregistered. I think the biggest one was Anwai Guru's through Fazul Mohammed, who was then the NGO Coordination Bureau Director. There was an attempt to deregister 900 organizations. All of this was resisted and fought back, and none of this came to pass to a large extent. But what we were left with is a post-2018 tension that largely was either, you could describe it as a Cold War, or essentially it was a policy vacuum. The NGO Coordination Act continued. There was no new framework for engagement. The Ministry of Interior funded probably about 8 NGO councils, one after the other, bought them, used them, and when they stopped delivering, they just rented another one or created another one. And therefore the sector really went into crisis. In 2017, 2020, we had an opportunity with Cabinet Secretary Kienjuri and Cabinet Secretary Matiangi, where both of them promised to commence the act, but both were unsuccessful in that sense. Fast forward a couple of years to 2022, when the United Democratic Alliance and the Kenya Kwanza manifesto was written, and the commencement of the PBO Act was written very much into the manifesto, but really no action over 2022, 2023, and in the background, growing tensions around the right to association. The introduction of a CBO Associations Act that was punitive, very clearly stated that human rights would not be the focus for community-based organizations. And that led to another round of advocacy and pushback from organizations like the Mathare Social Justice Network, Social Justice Center and Network, and others. But also, I think we need to point out that the right to association was fought against organizations that would like to have the words lesbian or gay in their association. So we saw a fairly intense battle at the judiciary for the right of the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission to be able to use those terms in their title. So, I guess many of us have continued to work, but the point is that we have not had an enabling environment, since the, I guess, the assent to the PBO Act. I think it's also important to point out, although it's not a legal issue, but defunding of the NGO sector has probably been the second biggest threat, and if not the second biggest threat, probably the primary threat for the sector. Many of us are experiencing 40% declines in funding. Funding is much more projectized. It forces us to work with people that organizations that we may not want to work with, and the cycles are much shorter, and the money is much less. What happened that led to the commencement? Well, I think, just to put it this way, I think from the beginning of the year, there has been quite a bit of international advocacy. A lot of us have pushed very hard in the promise of the civil society conference on the Pact for the Future, which took place 2 weeks ago, and also to some extent the trip that the president is currently having to the United States of America this week. And of course, all of us saw the commencement and the Gazette notice. The choice to Gazette first and then announce was strategic and well advised. And as a result, now we have the commencement. And as we know, it commenced last week. The last comment I would like to just touch on is, or the last set of comments, relates to the promise of the Act. And I'll go over this very quickly. I do hope all of us are speed reading the PBO Act, particularly those of us who read it 10 years ago or 8 years ago. It's important that we begin to internalize not just the short-term, I guess, steps towards the transition, but more importantly, how this is really an opportunity to reboot the sector as a whole and reframe ourselves. So there are probably 5 things that I think it's important that everybody is aware of. The first is that this has been best practice legislation. It provides a single identity for all organizations that are providing benefits to the public. What it doesn't include, so organizations that provide benefits or services or advocacy on behalf of its members are exempt from the PBO Act. Trade unions, merry-go-rounds, community-based groups that are focusing largely on their members, perhaps even residents' associations that focus purely on utilities and other services that are important to their members. But if you are an organization that is providing benefit to the broader public, then you are eligible to move from your existing registration to the Public Benefits Organization. As of a week ago, the NGO Coordination Act is dead. Therefore, for NGOs, there is, I assume, an automatic transition to the PBO regime or to the PBO law. And that will become clear in a few days in terms of what exactly is required. I suspect there will be a registration process. The second, I guess, implication or second promise is that it upgrades the accountability and the transparency that is required of us as PBOs to Chapter 6 levels. The third relates to the promise of greater collaboration between the 47 county governments, the one national administration, and PBOs, and there are clauses there that actually promote this idea of collaborative development. As Grace has said, the self-regulatory principle is embedded in this act, and in many ways, I think, better than the NGO Coordination Act. There is a code of conduct. There is talk of a judicially based tribunal for complaints. And for many of us who have to report under the NGO Coordination Act, we'll be happy to hear that there is a much easier regime of reporting to the PBO authority, the new version of the NGO Coordination Bureau. I think for many of us, any change to our directors, any change to our statutes, any banking changes that we make either require prior approval, or they require notification or information to the NGO Coordination Bureau within 14 days. The new act has shifted this to 60 days. Note that all PBOs will be required to essentially file their assets with the PBO authority on an annual basis. There is provision for a partnership and conflict resolution committee based on principles. That's in Schedule 1. And I think perhaps the most important thing I'd leave to the end, which is that the idea of the Public Benefits Organizations Act is essentially to create the incentive for you to want to become a PBO. What is that primarily? In Article 65 of the PBO Act, it encourages economic activities and tax incentives that PBOs will be granted in order to shift to the new I guess, to the new law. Let me turn very lastly to some of the implications. So the first one is for those of us who are public benefits organizations to review what this means for us individually as organizations. The second is that the PBO Act announces vacancy, that requires the Cabinet Secretary to announce vacancies for the position of members of the new PBO authority. This would be the old NGO Coordination Board, and this needs to be done in 14 days. This is Schedule 3 of the Act, and I think probably we've not spent a lot of time focusing on this. This does not affect the administration and the director of the NGO Coordination Bureau, but it does affect the NGO Coordination Board. The NGO Council, which is currently led by Stephen Cheboy, that is recognized by the NGO Coordination Bureau, is enabled to remain in office for 1 year. And then I think the other two things that I wanted to mention essentially was we should expect and prepare for the development of rules and regulations as quickly as possible. We should expect and prepare for attempts to amend the Act, and we need to be ready with those. Fortunately, on both of these, civil society and the government in previous iterations, whether it be 2020 or 2018, there are draft documents for us to start with. There is no reason to start from scratch and develop this. So let me just stop by saying two thoughts. One is that we need to build constituency across the organizations who would like to join the Public Benefits Organizations Act. It has been almost 20 years of policy lacuna and a vacuum, and therefore for us to really harness the Act to create a single movement of public benefits organizations that can protect itself, protect Kenyans, and expand the constitutional freedoms. We're going to have to be very deliberate in terms of how we bring people together in an inclusive and I guess empowering way. The last one relates to resources. So for those of you who have existing resources, those of you who can find additional resources, it is important that we find ways of resourcing the next 1 year particularly, but the next 5 to 10 years for this sector to be able to use the opportunity of the public benefits organizations to do two things. One is to restore the vitality and the power of the sector. And I might even add the integrity of the sector, because for some organizations, the lack of oversight has really allowed for vices that are very far from the values of the sector historically. And then secondly, I think it's important that we are thinking very deliberately about the financial models that we operate within. I think the NGO died as a financial model possibly about 5 years ago. And therefore, many of us are trying to keep this model going in the absence of an international community that is willing to resource the sector in ways that it has in the past. And therefore, I think thinking about social enterprise, thinking about not-for-profit, resource mobilization, membership, merchandise, and investments is probably the most important thing that the PBO now gives us the opportunity to work on. Allow me to stop there, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irungu, for that context of where we're coming from, what we need to really look out for, and where we need to position ourselves. Welcome to those who have just joined us. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And I do want to recognize that a number of people on this call have really been significant in bringing us to this current situation where we are at, but also have worked over the years, as Irungu has said, with regards to this work. And as part of recognizing that, and also recognizing that we may have people who have not been in the sector before, there was a guide developed. This guide was developed right when we had the Act, and this was done by the Poverty Eradication Network, PEN in 2014. It was republished by Uraia Trust in 2018, and then again by PEN in 2020. Just a caution that this current guide, we'll make available, it's a guide on the PBO Act is a useful starting point in terms of summary. But as Irungu has said, there could be some changes that have come even with the commencement that we have had. And so also ensuring that people have access to the right legislation that we are reading from the same hymn sheet. So from Irungu's conversation, there is things we need to think about moving forward, not only in terms of the structures that are there, positioning for those structures, ensuring that we have the right people within them, the transitional matters, issues that will come up in terms of organizations at an individual level, registration. If I've not been an NGO, but I've been registered under a different regime, what does that mean for me? How do I become, how do I get the benefits of the PBO Act? And also very key from what Irungu has said, in terms of building constituency, being inclusive and empowering. And with that, we do know that there are a number of conversations ongoing, different meetings that have been called. And this is just one of the very many to make sure that as many people have information about what's going on, and also that we have more engagement on this matter. So that brings us to Mr. John Owegi, who is the Executive Director for Civic Freedoms Forum. And Civic Freedoms Forum was founded in October 2021 as a platform comprising of civil society organizations that were really operating at the national level with a track record and a commitment to the protection of human rights, civil liberties, and democracy. So CFF has a number of members who have also been very instrumental in bringing us to this point. They were there when we were undertaking the drafting. And so CFF has also been organizing a series of meetings and is planning for a PBO summit, whereby organizations will be able to have more information, but also that we can be more proactive rather than reactive as we have reached this point. So ladies and gentlemen, let me invite John, just take us through what's been going on, what have been the current conversations, how do we move forward, where can people plug in, and really give us a lay of the land in terms of what we need to look out for. Karibu sana, John.
Good morning. Just probably first is mic check, and I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, so let me just say that 10th of May announcement came as a surprise to most of us because, again, we've been very skeptical about the promises and the continued commitment that the PBO Act would be commenced soon. I mean, I can remember last year in May, that is 2023, during the NGO Summit, when the PS Interior actually stood and said that there was nothing that would stop the government from commencing the act before the end of last year. And of course, we took that as the usual commitments, like the previous sentiments from the former administration. So even as we were organizing for the 2024 UN Civil Society Conference, we were very skeptical in terms of what the government would do with those recommendations. So when he made the announcement, we were still very skeptical. I can remember in one of the platforms when Mr. Irungu posted that, the president had made a commitment that, had instructed the cabinet secretary to gazette the commencement date. I think one of my first questions was, Mr. Irungu, where is the gazette notice? Yeah, and so at around 9 p.m., 1 minute past 9 p.m., we saw a gazette notice, and we still ask an additional question, has it been verified? Yeah, so that tells you how skeptical the sector was. And having realized that it was real, we had a sector that, other than celebrating, there was a lot of confusion. And that confusion is still ongoing. So CFF took a step back to just think about how best do we go on from here, because now most of the organization were everywhere on Twitter, some trying to organize Twitter spaces, webinars to sensitize, which are all very good initiatives. But then, we asked ourselves, how do we do this in a more coordinated manner? How do we ensure that we have most voices in one room, moving with one voice as a sector, working towards implementation, probably even organizing a campaign for this, for implementation of this new law. Yeah, and so we identified a smaller team of around 30 to have a meeting in Nairobi. That was last week on the 15th at Jacaranda Hotel in Westlands, to just identify what are those key components or key interventions that must take place. Number one, during the transition period, that is up to until May next year, but also looking at what needs to happen even beyond May next year, 2025. The other question that we also addressed is, as we are working through the transition phase, there are those potential risks or threats that the sector needs to be aware of, even as we as we consolidate our campaign for smooth implementation. And so the outcome of Jacaranda then laid ground in terms of how can we coordinate the process, and including what are those next steps that we may want to engage in, either separately or jointly, but also what are those obvious threats. So if you allow me, Grace, first of all, I'll just present I'll talk about what we need to do, or what is already happening and what will be happening first, beyond now what Mr. Irungu has said, so that I avoid repeating in terms of the structures that need to be put in place. So my talking points will majorly be on what the sector members, that is the civil society, are planning to do within the next 12 months and beyond, rather than the structures that that needs to be put in place that Mr. Irungu has already mentioned. So one, after last week's meeting, some of those items, or interventions that were identified as crucial are also, number one is organizing shuttle diplomacy. And this was, number one, to reach out to the wider sector members, including the international organizations, the national organizations, including some county or devolved, organizations that work at devolved units. Now we were moving beyond just the governance, the NGOs or the PBOs working on governance sector. So the shuttle diplomacy with the civil society was to go beyond and at least reach most, if not all, of the sectors, so that we can have them in one room and begin this conversation. And yeah, that brings me to why next week on Tuesday 28th, we have planned a PBO pre-summit conference for civil society, mostly the country directors, the executive directors, and advocacy leads from international organizations, national, and some from the counties, or most of them actually coming from the counties. Secondly, the shuttle diplomacy was to also go on, specifically focusing on development partners. That has also been going on separately and some jointly, meeting some of our traditional development partners to just discuss the need, number one, to unlock some budgets. Most of the development partners in the past have been very skeptical, especially when it comes to allocating budgets for advocacy around commencement of the PBO Act. Currently now what we are trying to do is to have bilateral discussions for flexibility of some of those budget lines, including whether we can also have some rapid response funds released, because now you realize that as Irungu has said, some of the interventions are tied to timelines. For example, by Tuesday next week, according to this law, we should be having the cabinet secretary gazetting vacancy for members of the board of the authority. So that conversation with development partners is also going on. One of those very political shuttle diplomacy that we also envision to attend to is reaching out to the different factions of the NGO Council that the Act expects to transit to the PBO Federation. We have had over the past few years more than 3 factions of the NGO Council. We know that, of course, one is legally recognized by the previous board, which is currently the PBO's regulatory authority. But all the 3 factions, as we speak now, lack legitimacy. None of them have conducted any annual general assembly. None of them have active membership. And so, yeah, we are trying to find a team that can reach out to them. The preliminary observation is that all of them are keen on having one federation. And so they are keen on sitting to probably come up with one federation. And of course, we have other reservations from some of those factions. There are also plans to have separate meetings with the PBO regulatory authority, previously the board, and of course the ministry that is in charge of where this act is currently hosted, which is the Interior. Of course, we'll talk about some legal complications about where it is currently hosted versus what the Act envisages. Now, the other very key component that we have identified that must be undertaken is a legal analysis and verification of what is currently in the government printers. There is a possibility that we may be having 3 versions of this law. In early 2013, just after the assent by the former president, the late His Excellency Mwai Kibaki.
Sorry, John, sorry to interrupt you. You've gone a bit off screen. Maybe you can adjust your laptop. We're seeing half of you. Sorry for
sorry. Oh, is that fine now? Yeah, I think that's
that's perfect. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so we have we are trying to bring up a legal team that can do the verification right from the Hansard to what was assented to, but also looking at what is what has just been gazetted and which is presently at the government printers. In addition to that, we also have another layer of analysis that we are also currently doing. We have quite a number of sections conflicting and some sections that are problematic within the current law. And so we would want to just have a clear highlight of what those gaps look like, so that even as we walk through the transition, then it is very clear for everyone that these are things that we will need to relook at. Now, something that most of us have been doing is sensitization of this act. But now to have a coordinated and to target very many people, what we've done is to make requests and of course begin a conversation around development of popular version. We are working with PEN Kenya and of course Uraia, which had already previously developed one of the simplified version that Madam Grace was showing us on the screen. We are trying to find whether, find resources to develop an even popular simplified version, which probably would be a revised edition of what Grace showed us. But in addition to that, we're also looking at digital versions, audiovisual versions with both Swahili in English and also sign language integrated within. And of course, those, including some frequently asked questions. Currently, international organizations are asking a very frequent, a common question: what does that mean for us? Organizations that are registered outside, that were registered outside the currently repealed law, the NGOs Coordination Act, the trust, the foundations, the community groups are asking, what does it mean for us? How long should we wait? Should we also look at whether the federation is split or, so we have very common questions. So we're trying to gather all those questions to come up with a common frequently asked question chart, which can also help in the sensitization. But what we are also urging is, can we have a more coordinated sensitization that also goes to the counties, regional blocks, even as we look at the national level sensitization that is happening on Twitters and webinars and Zooms. Finally, not necessarily finally, but we, of course, have agreed that we need to have a joint meeting to improve our coordination and collaboration. And that brings me to our June PBO Summit. We are trying, the June PBO Summit will bring together, if not all, maybe majority of the PBOs and those registered outside the former NGO Coordination Act. This PBO, the summit will also bring on board the relevant government stakeholders, so that we can jointly agree on, jointly have commitments towards commencement of this law. And of course, we are hoping that this meeting then takes place the second week of June, probably the 13th and 14th of June. That would be a Thursday or a Friday, but that will be settled on next week on Tuesday, when we have most people in the room. Yeah, so we also expect something that probably the Act envisages is a joint committee that will be established, of course, to oversee commitments by both government and the civil society. The Act envisages half from both sectors, and it's talking about 15 members. So we will be working with the PBO's regulatory authority to just jointly draft the TORs for this committee. And of course, as that happens, building consensus on who from the civil society then can join that committee. And of course, then the government from their side can also identify who are those that will join that committee, because now this committee is going to be very instrumental in doing annual reports for commitments made by both governments. Of course, focusing on the principles and values that are prescribed in this law, but also just looking at what is it that have been committed by government in terms of enabling the civic space, and also what gaps exist from the civil society in terms of their compliance to, of course, the Act. We have the rules and regulations, of course, that my colleague Irungu also mentioned. And we have, of course, the draft that was done by the PBO's regulatory authority a few years back. We also had another version done by the civil society. And so the first thing that we are aiming to do is to have a consultative meeting with the regulatory authority, so that we can see whether we can harmonize these two drafts. Of course, after, when that is done, then we can then move to the next step where they can be gazetted for public participation. And again, there is going to be another need for production of simplified versions of this, including several IEC materials to increase sensitization, so that the process of public participation then is informed by access to quality information and simplified versions of this regulation. So again, that process needs to go to the counties. That process needs to go to the regional level, and of course, then culminating into a national level forums where then citizens and public benefits organizations can actually give their feedback before it is tabled, even before the National Assembly for adoption. So those would be the key milestones that we envision to undertake as a team. We are trying as much as possible to reach out to as many sector leaders as possible. The first strategy is looking at the coalitions that exist, whether it is health, whether it's the Integrity Alliance, election, children, youth, the key populations, the LGBTIQ, the sex workers, the youth, the indigenous community, all those coalitions. I think that is our first step for reaching out to as many as possible. Of course, then the journey to the PBO summit, which begins next week on Tuesday, we'll also get into the next layer of mobilization, where now those coalition members now reach out to their, the coalition leaders now reach out to their members. And of course, we see how many we can mobilize for the summit that is to take place in June. Yeah, so allow me to leave it at that point. I can see time has also just gone, and probably I'll of course continue in case there are any other clarities that members here would want to get. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Irungu, for both speaking to us with regards to that. We do have some questions in the chat box that I will direct our two panelists to speak to, but I can see we have a hand up. Felicia, if you can come on mic and ask your question. Karibu.
Hi, Grace. I was the one who raised my hand. This is Kimberly Ludwig. I'm the director of the Office of Democratic Governance, Peace and Security. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry my camera doesn't seem to be working this morning. I just wanted to give a quick response to something that John has mentioned. That is that Kenyan civil society needs to get together, figure out a strategy for the next steps in seeing a proper rollout of the implementation of the PBO Act. I couldn't agree more. We'd very much like to see kind of a concerted effort rather than multiple groups trying to represent civil society in holding a national dialogue or whatever it is that Kenyan civil society is hoping to do to kind of launch the implementation of the Act. I just wanted to mention, however, John's point on we need to unlock funds from the donors. I'd encourage everyone to think about that in a very different way. At least for USAID, and I'm sure for my counterparts at the other embassies and international donors, we'd very much like to be seen as your partner in rolling out the PBO implementation and not as just a source of funds. I think that means that we'd like to have a strategic discussion around how donors are going to work together in partnership with civil society in launching the implementation. And we look forward to further discussions around that. We currently have the program with KCDF Ubora Mashinani, and we are talking with Grace and others about how resources might be applied to this strategizing. We don't want to talk about how resources might be applied to one group's activity or another group's activity. We want to talk about how we're going to do this in a strategic manner. So I just wanted to put that out there for folks to think about. I'm also going to be reaching out to the other international donor partners and figuring out how we can coordinate this on our side. I think the very worst thing that could happen at this point is for multiple organizations to write multiple proposals to multiple donors and have lots of events at hotels popping up around Nairobi. That is not the best use of our resources for the average Kenyan citizen. So I just wanted to raise that point. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that, for the comments and also some of the insights. For Irungu and for John, as others come on, there are a number of questions in the chat box, some of them that I will respond to. There's a question with regards to, from George, given that the regulations are yet to be published, it is then unclear and confusing the immediate next steps that PBO should take in terms of aligning their registration and their affairs. Is there a platform that can help with more information and analysis? So yes, George, there's work ongoing with regards to that. There's engagement with the PBO authority, which is drafting regulations. As has been mentioned, there are different regulations out there, but there's work ongoing in terms of consolidating that. I know CFF is putting together the legal team as well to help in terms of some of that analysis. And in case, John, Irungu, if there's something you want to add as Rashid comes to ask, I think, a question or make a comment. John or Irungu?
Happy to jump in on a couple.
Yeah.
Sorry, John,
Yes,
go ahead.
go on.
Okay. All right, a couple of thoughts. So, Francis, and greetings, brother. I'm sure you have a few scars from the battles of protecting the sector from the early 2000s. Is the regime singular or dual? Can organizations have two registrations? I think the intention of the Act is to create a singular registration, but the rules and regulations are not yet out, so therefore that could be, I guess that could be clarified further. The second thing I think with regards to that is important for us to protect the principle that migrating to the Public Benefits Organizations Act is voluntary, not mandatory, right? This was one of the things that many of us fought for in the early days, but it is, I guess, it is desirable in the sense that you will have a much better enabling, I guess, legal framework for your operations, and particularly the point I made about social enterprise is the key thing there. But if you are registered under the NGO Coordination Act, then your registration will be null and void, I assume, is what will be proposed. So for NGOs, we really have no choice except to move to company limited by guarantee or others. But I think the challenge there will be that as you move from being an NGO to another legislation, if in your statutes it's very clear that you provide public benefits, they may route you back to the PBO Act. So I hope that's a little bit clearer. The second point is, I think, around the platform. In addition to what Grace says, I think the NGO Coordination Board will very quickly, in their new form as the PBO authority, they will probably roll out a series of simple what-to-dos for many of us. So I think we can expect that in the next few months or weeks or so. The third point, I think, relates to the advocacy that we do right now. And I think we have to be very careful not to, I guess, disaggregate the PBO Act too much, that it becomes unworkable, and we give a loophole for those people who are very content to keep us under the NGO Coordination Act to do so, to paralyze the PBO Act, to paralyze its provisions, and essentially keep us, in an even more confused state of legal limbo. So I think we have to be very clear what's good enough for us to work with, what is not acceptable and contrary to the spirit of the Act. But the focus has to be on the rules and regulations, and as I say, the suspicion that there will be a bunch of amendments brought quickly. Let's not encourage amendments at a time when I think the environment remains still hostile or indifferent at best.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irungu. John?
Yeah, so I think Irungu has technically answered most of that, but I just wanted to confirm that, yes, if you are not registered previously under the NGOs Coordination Act that is now repealed, then if you decide to apply for registration under the PBO Act, the Act says it very clearly that your previous registration then becomes invalid. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much. And I think from what Kimberly has said, what you've said, Irungu, John, we really must have coordination, clarity, and collaboration. So let me invite Mohammed. Do you have a question or a comment? Rashid Mohammed?
Yes. My name is Rashid Mohammed. I'm from a small community-based organization called Ireland's Action Forum, based in Mandera County. First and foremost, I would like to thank what Mr. John has taken us through. But before that, Mr. Irungu spoke to the issue of, there must be a very clear cut in terms of, ensuring that the PBO Act should not be paralyzed. And he said we should avoid, loopholes and be careful around that. So I was just asking, partly I have been also advantaged to attend, the agitation for the passage of the PBO Act. But it looks like there was a lot of drumming up support from the sector those days, when the PBO Act, some members of parliament were trying to say it will not be passed, it will be done, this and this will be done to it. So, many of the sector people were looking forward to the passage of the Act. Now that the Act has been passed, there are other issues that are again cropping up. So, those of us at the rural areas also need to understand, because I'm very well aware there were also, even within the sector, there were some organizations that were leading these things. That was, so how do we get out of, are we headed to another quagmire? Like, what now, the fear, now even Irungu talked about, we should be very clear about not paralyzing, the PBO. We should not come up with so many rules and regulations and amendments. How will this contrast be, addressed? And then finally, Mr. John spoke to, a summit. Many people are not, and he raised about, if you are a coalition, if you are a network, if you are an alliance, if you are IPs, that is indigenous people. So we need to spread the. So I was just asking, there is a summit now he talked about, which is, I don't know, he said June. Who is doing this summit? Who is the coordination for this summit? And then surely, after the passage, which was just at the UN summit the other day, is there enough and ample time to hold this summit, or are we in a mad rush holding this summit? Can we, if your intent and purpose is fixed on that date of holding the summit on June, can we disseminate the information? Because the information has not gotten, well, this thing was just passed the other day, but the struggle of the act, everybody knows from so many years. Now that it is passed, let us try to make sure that everybody is in the picture and everybody understands. Because I know of some even coalitions who decided to transit from a coalition, I mean from the NGO to trust, just some 2 or 1 years ago. I don't know now which way is better for them. What about associations? What about, trust, like you talked about, coalitions, networks? So that's all I wanted to say. But I really appreciate the two organizations that organized this PBO Act. And finally, Mr. John, how do we know who will hold this summit? Those of us at the grassroots, are we allowed? How can we get to it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashid Mohammed, and everyone. I can see a lot of questions in the chat box and a lot of comments. In terms of how we are tying this up together, first, we are taking all the questions that have been asked in the chat box, and they will go into the FAQ document that CFF and others are working on. So that's one of the clear steps that we are doing. The other is that ensuring that as many people are getting this information. So a lot of networks are coordinating behind the scenes to ensure that information gets out. So I know we are coordinating very closely with the philanthropy sector and with different other organizations, and everyone is to make sure the information gets out. For Mr. Mohammed, in terms of who is organizing, why is there a rush? Just to clarify again, because of the act and the timelines that were put in, some of the timelines are quite tight. And so hence, you are seeing the move with speed to ensure that we do not lose any opportunity. And we do recognize that we may not always get it right, but enable us and guide us on how to do it well so that we make sure the information goes out. One point of contact for any information that you want with regards to any of the meetings happening. I'm inviting John and Irungu and my KCDF colleagues to put in the various email addresses to which you can send your questions, your comments, and we'll make sure that we, as we're coordinating with other groups, that the information and your questions get to the right group. So ladies and gentlemen, really this was a briefing session. We recognize and we do apologize. We're not able to cover everything within 1 hour, but just to ensure that there's a catch up with regards to what's happening. And so we will endeavor to make sure that this information is on all our social media platforms, whether it's for CFF, for Amnesty International Kenya, as well as KCDF, and also the other CFF members. I invite you to visit the CFF website. You'll see all the other members who are within that platform, and also more information will be disseminated. For now, it's to say thank you so much for your time. And we do look forward to more engagement, more questions through email, so that then we can make sure that everything is within the FAQs. And we look forward really to, as I've said, again, better coordination, clarity, and collaboration. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on other platforms around this very important conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day.